At the family gathering, my father said, "We're giving all the money to your sister, Harper. She is the future of this family. And you're a failure." When I opened the red envelope my mother handed me, there was $1, along with a small note that read, "Good luck, Clara." They burst out laughing. My grandfather stood up, pointed at my parents, and said, "You just wait." Then he pulled me out of that house. Yes, what he did next changed everything. But before I continue the story, where are you watching this from? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe, so I can tell you the whole truth. My name is Clara, 29 years old, and I grew up in a quiet suburb north of Boston, where triangle-roofed houses lined up beneath rows of red maples every fall. My family wasn't wealthy, but we got by, at least from the outside. My father, James, was a civil engineer who took early retirement, and my mother, Margaret, used to be an art teacher. My younger sister, Harper, is 4 years younger than me, the constant center of attention. Harper had golden, glossy hair, mesmerizing blue eyes, and a refined fashion sense from a young age. To my parents, she was the shining star, the one destined to bring honor to the family through school fashion shows, widely shared photos on Facebook, and compliments from neighbors. And me? I was the kind who did everything quietly, winning school-level painting contests, graduating with honors in interior design, paying my own tuition through part-time jobs. But every one of my achievements would usually receive a brief, "Yeah, that's good," and then fade into oblivion. On winter nights, when we gathered by the fireplace, my mother would hand Harper a new knitted scarf, then turn to me. "You still have the old one, don't you?" I used to think I was just being too sensitive. But gradually, the feeling of being left behind became constant, as if I were a silent shadow within my own home. Every holiday, Harper was always the first to be asked about. Every time I tried to share a new design idea, my mother would shake her head. "You should learn from Harper. Fashion makes more money than wall painting." I grew up under unspoken comparisons, where all my efforts were overshadowed by my sister's brilliance. Yet amidst all that coldness, there was one person who always saw me, my grandmother, Beatrice. She was the only one who believed in my talent, who encouraged me to hold on to my passion for design, who always said, "One day, Clara, you'll build things no one dares to dream of, not with bricks, but with your heart." I never forgot her words, but I never expected that very belief, that legacy she left for me, would become the thing that turned my entire family against me, pushing me to the edge of collapse. And then, a family gathering, a sealed envelope, and a single dollar bill changed everything. The party was held on a Saturday afternoon at my family's old estate, the one that used to belong to my late grandmother Beatrice, who had passed away 3 years earlier. Ebony wood doors, high ceilings, and the grandfather clock still bore the traces of time, even though I was the one who personally restored every brick, repainted every wall to keep the house from falling apart. They called it a family gathering, but it was really the unveiling of a new generation financial plan. My father, James, in a gray suit, stood in the living room like a wealthy businessman, talking about future visions, investing in the right people and the right industries. My mother beamed as Harper walked out from the kitchen, dressed in a pure white dress, softly curled hair, lips tinted with perfect nude. And then came the loud applause when my father solemnly announced, "The family will invest $1.3 million from the inheritance fund for Harper to launch her own fashion company." I stood in the corner of the room, among the plants I had brought and nurtured, the paintings I had chosen and framed, unnoticed. Then, my mother walked over and handed me a small envelope. I opened it. Inside was a single dollar bill and a handwritten note. "Good luck, Clara." I looked up, trying to stay composed, but my eyes were burning. A few guests burst out laughing, thinking it was a funny joke, but I knew it wasn't a joke. It was their way of telling me I had no worth. I was an outsider in my own home. No one stood up in protest. No one came to my defense. Except for my grandfather. Austin, who had been quietly watching everything from a chair by the window. He stood up, his eyes filled with fury, pointing at my parents. "You've forgotten what Beatrice left for Clara. You're betraying your own mother." The room fell silent, but my father just chuckled. "You still dream too much, Dad." Harper took my father's arm, her voice light as a breeze. "Clara will be fine. I believe in her." I turned away, without a word. But inside, a crack had begun to form. And maybe that crack was the beginning of a battle they never saw coming. That evening, I left the party early, driving back to my small apartment in South Boston, less than 20 minutes from my grandmother's house, but it felt like a world away. I didn't turn on the lights when I came in, just dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and sank to the floor. The shame lingered, seeping into every breath. I looked at the $1 bill and the handwritten note from my mother, still in my bag. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I felt so empty I couldn't summon tears. The next morning, I got a call from Grandpa Austin. His voice was hoarse, slow, but firm. "Clara, can you come see me? There's something I've kept inside for too long." I went to his place that noon, a shabby third-floor apartment in the Dorchester neighborhood where he lived alone after Grandma passed. On the dining table was a small wooden box, along with some old, yellowed envelopes. He poured me a cup of tea, then let out a deep sigh. "Clara, your father did something wrong." Then he handed me a copy of my grandmother's original will, notarized, clearly signed, stating that the entire house and investment portfolio were to be left to me. "Your grandmother believed in you because you're the only one who preserved this house with your heart," he said. Then quietly, he handed me a USB stick. "Listen to this." I plugged it into my laptop. In the recording was my father's voice, clear and unmistakable, speaking to another man, likely a lawyer. "I know Beatrice left everything to Clara, but Harper needs the money more. She could multiply it tenfold. Clara, she barely makes enough decorating throw pillows." I clenched my fist hearing that. The recording continued, with Harper's voice. "Dad, if I can launch my own brand, you and Mom won't have to worry about retirement. But Clara, she lives too simply. She can't really help." The silence afterward was like a knife. I looked at Grandpa, who sat quietly, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "I overheard them when they thought I'd fallen asleep in the living room," he said. "I know you don't want to stir trouble, but you deserve to know the truth." I nodded without a word, but for the first time a fire started to burn within me. And this time, I wasn't going to put it out. Monday morning, I woke up early, opened my laptop and typed into the search bar, "Will dispute attorney in Boston." Dozens of results came up, but I picked a familiar name, Laura Bennett, a lawyer known for high-profile family inheritance cases, someone I'd read about in an article 2 years ago. I emailed her, attaching a copy of the will, the audio recording, and a request for urgent consultation. I didn't expect a quick response, but just 3 hours later, her assistant called back, scheduling an appointment that very afternoon. Laura's office was on the 17th floor of a glass building overlooking the Charles River. She was in her 50s, dark brown hair neatly tied, her voice slow but razor-sharp. When I told her everything, from the $2 envelope, to the recording, to the feeling of being erased from the very house whose walls I once painted, she didn't show pity, only said, "We have clear grounds. Very clear. But I need more evidence showing Clara wasn't just the nominal heir, but also the one who preserved the actual value of the home." I nodded and pulled from my bag a prepared folder. Receipts for paint, plumbing repairs, photos documenting each stage of the renovations, all meticulously saved over the years, not for any purpose, just habit. "Good," she said. If necessary, we can use these to prove that you maintain the property with your own labor and money. That's very important in court. I exhaled deeply. Not relief, but the feeling of someone finally recognizing my effort as something with legal worth, not just for fun. When I left her office, the sun was setting in the west, casting golden light over the distant glass towers. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the stream of traffic, and told myself, this time, I won't let it all pass me by. They can forget my graduation day, they can laugh at my design dreams, but they will no longer decide who deserves to keep that house. This time, I'll fight, not just for the house, but for all the years I was made to feel invisible. 3 weeks later, Harper's wedding invitation arrived in my mailbox, thick, heavy, wrapped in red velvet, with ornate gold lettering that screamed extravagance. I stared at it for a while, not because I was debating whether to go, but because I knew this appearance would be unlike any other. Harper was having her wedding at a luxury resort along Cape Cod's coastline, with white sand beaches and scenery straight out of a bridal magazine. My family, their friends, fashion investors, even those who once laughed at my wall painting dreams, they would all be there, and I would stand among them, not with flowers or a gown, but with evidence. I spent the following week preparing. Laura Bennett helped me organize the documents, highlighting legal details, the notarized will, the recording, and proof of my expenses in repairing and decorating the house. She even prepared a statement from the architect who had worked with me during the renovation. The more objective witnesses, the better, she said. But the legal prep wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was learning to stand up in front of those who had made me feel invisible. Each night leading up to the wedding, I dreamed of the old house, me standing outside the window, watching the family dinner inside as they laughed together. One night, I dreamed of Grandma, sitting in her familiar armchair, smiling and saying, "They don't see you, but I do." I'd wake up with swollen eyes, but my hand always gripping the copy of the will placed on my nightstand. A few days before the wedding, Grandpa Austin called. He said he'd go with me. "You're not alone, Clara," he said, "and if you ever feel scared, just squeeze my hand 3 times. I'll speak up." I smiled, though my eyes blurred again. My best friend, Sophie, also decided to come. "No one's going to silence you, not even in a room full of gowns and pretty faces," she said, half joking, half serious. I realized I wasn't alone. I had my lawyer, I had proof, I had my grandfather, I had friends. And more importantly, I had the truth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to seek recognition. I was going to reclaim what was stolen, in silence, through forged signatures, through the belief that I would never fight back. They were wrong, and I would make them see. The wedding took place on a June afternoon, with soft sunlight stretching across the pine trees, lining the shores of Cape Cod. The resort where Harper held the celebration sat right by the water, with a spacious garden, white tents set up along the walkway, and white orchid petals drifting gently in the breeze. I arrived earlier than expected, not to take photos or offer congratulations, but to check one last time the USB containing the recording and the documents printed and clipped in a plain black folder. I wore a dark, square-neck dress, not flashy but just enough not to vanish among the sea of lace dresses and glittering heels. Sophie, my cousin, Aunt Emma's daughter, walked beside me. We had grown up together, and although Sophie never spoke out publicly, I always knew she was the only one in the family who believed in me. At every gathering, she was the one who quietly pulled me out from the shadows. Today, her hand gripped her purse, eyes scanning the venue like she was ready to shield me from any storm. "If anyone tries to stop you, I'll raise hell," she whispered. I smiled. Grandpa Austin had already arrived, seated in the second row near the stage, leaning on his cane, face stern as stone. When he saw me, he gave a slight nod, just enough to ground me amidst a sea of strangers. Guests milled around the reception area, laughter and chatter filled the air. Harper emerged from behind the wedding tent, fitted ivory dress, purple orchid bouquet in hand, looking flawless, like she had stepped off a Vogue cover. When her eyes passed over me, she paused briefly, then smiled, walked over and whispered, "Call Clara! And I'm really glad you came." I only looked at her, said nothing. She didn't know I wasn't here to give blessings. I came to expose. Once everyone was seated, the MC invited family members to give their speeches. My mother, in a pale pink lace dress, stood up first, speaking about Harper's journey from a little girl with a unique fashion sense to a young entrepreneur full of potential. My father followed, emphasizing that today isn't just a wedding day. It's the day we pass on our hopes and love to the next generation. I tightened my grip on the folder in my hand. As applause rippled through the garden, I stood up. "Excuse me, may I say a few words?" The entire venue fell silent for a moment. My mother's eyes widened, my father squinted, Harper paused mid-step. The MC looked unsure, but I had already stepped toward the stage. "My name is Clara, the bride's older sister." Before everyone continues with the celebration, I'd like to share some information concerning the legal ownership of our family's estate, I said, my voice steady, as if reciting a confession I'd practiced dozens of times. The entire garden seemed to hold its breath. My mother stood up. "Clara, not now." But I raised my hand calmly. "I believe that precisely because today Harper is being presented as the heir and representative of the family legacy, this is the most appropriate moment." I opened the folder, pulled out a copy of my grandmother's original will, notarized, clearly signed, and displayed it using a portable projector prepared in advance with my attorney, Laura Bennett, who was seated in the back row. The screen on stage shifted from romantic wedding photos to a legal document, with a bold line reading, "All property and investment assets shall be transferred to Clara Emerson, eldest granddaughter, the one who has preserved and maintained this estate." A few murmurs began to spread. I wasn't finished. "And this," I said, "is the reason why this will was never carried out." I inserted the USB into the laptop already connected. The speakers turned on. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. My father's voice echoed, low, clear, and cold. "I know Beatrice left everything to Clara, but Harper needs the money more. She could multiply it tenfold. Clara, she barely makes a living decorating throw pillows." Gasps broke out. A woman in the left row covered her mouth. The recording continued. Harper's voice followed. "Dad, if I can start my own brand, you and Mom won't have to worry about retirement. But Clara, I don't think she can help. She lives too simply." At this point, no one said anything. Everyone sat still, as if witnessing a public indictment played in the middle of a christening. Harper stood frozen. My mother clutched my father's hand, who was now red-faced, muttering something to the MC. I looked down at them, for the first time without bowing my head. I don't need anyone's apology. I only want the truth revealed, and my rightful share returned, in honor of the promise made by the person I respected most. Beatrice Emerson. I turned to Harper, my voice low. "And you knew it, all along." Harper didn't reply. She just stood there, clutching her bouquet, eyes blinking rapidly like she was searching for an exit that didn't exist in that room. From the back, Attorney Laura stood, holding up a legal affidavit. "I confirm that all documents presented by Ms. Clara Emerson are legally valid. If necessary, we will pursue civil litigation for fraud and abuse of inheritance assets." The wedding atmosphere popped like a soap bubble. Whispers turned into an awkward silence. Harper's future in-laws stood up. The mother adjusted her designer dress. The father stared directly at James. A few guests took out their phones, discreetly recording. Some guests quietly gathered their handbags, whispering among themselves, glancing at Harper and my parents as if witnessing a car crash they couldn't look away from. My father, James, cleared his throat. He stepped forward, took the microphone from the MC, his face strained into a forced smile. I want to explain. You've only heard part of the story. Everything I did to protect this family's future. He looked around, then turned to me, trying to soften his voice. Clara, you know your mother and I always wanted the best for you both. I said nothing, only stared at him, as if waiting for him to hear the absurdity in his own words. Harper had stepped up beside me by then, her voice sharp, stripped of its earlier politeness. You chose to ruin my big day? I'm not surprised, honestly. I turned to face her for the first time all evening, my gaze steady. No, Harper. I didn't ruin anything. I'm just reclaiming what's mine. I pulled out one final document, a financial statement bearing Harper's signature, proving she received $1.3 million from the family account just weeks after our grandmother's death. And if you think you can build a grand day on someone else's stolen effort, you're wrong. Harper's lips pressed into a line, her eyes brimming with fury. My mother stood behind, clutching my father's hand, whispering something, but neither of them stepped forward to challenge the evidence. They just stood there, powerless. Grandpa Austin left his seat, walked up onto the stage, and stood beside me. Family, friends, he said, voice steady and clearer than his years would suggest. I lived in that house more than half my life. I know who kept it alive and who sacrificed so it could remain intact today. Don't let a wedding dress or some press release blind you. Then he turned to me, his thin but warm hand resting on my shoulder. I didn't need to say anything more. The evidence had been presented. Those who needed to hear had heard. Those who needed to be silent had fallen silent. Harper's future in-laws left first, saying nothing. Then a few familiar guests followed. Some shook my hand, some bowed politely, and one even whispered, "You're very brave." Harper stood, alone on stage, bouquet limp in her hands, eyes dazed, as if she finally realized the curtain had fallen, and she was no longer the star of this ending. That night, I returned to my apartment in silence. No messages, no calls, not a single apology. But I wasn't expecting any. I turned on the lights, set the folder on the table, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but because my body hadn't yet caught up with the shift, from being a shadow at the edge of the room, to the person who just brought down an entire wedding with 3 folders and a recording. The next morning, I went to Laura Bennett's office with all the original documents. She greeted me not with her usual sternness, but with a slight nod, as if to say, "Well done." We reviewed the case file, including the will, the recording, the repair receipts, and Harper's bank statement provided by my grandfather, to file a civil lawsuit against my father, James Emerson, and Harper Emerson, for inheritance fraud and unauthorized asset transfer. This case isn't just about reclaiming ownership, Laura said. It's about restoring justice, both legally and emotionally, within your family. I sat silently for a long while, looking out the window. The city of Boston moved on as usual outside, but something within me had shifted. I was no longer seeking recognition. I wanted justice, and this time, the law was on my side. The lawsuit was filed by the end of the week. The court sent out a summons within 2 weeks, requesting responses and supplemental documents from the involved parties. Harper hired a different legal team, young, sharp, but clearly under pressure. I didn't see them in person, but Laura showed me their official response, in which Harper claimed all financial decisions were made through family consensus and mutual trust among members. No apology, no admission of guilt. They were still fighting me, even though the truth was clear. But I wasn't alone. My grandfather was ready to testify. Sophie helped me organize every file. Laura emailed updates each night and reminded me to rest. I spent one afternoon visiting the old house, the place my grandmother once lived, the place I was now fighting to reclaim with truth. I stood on the porch, looking at the weather-worn wooden door, and placed my hand on the doorknob, whispering to myself, "Grandma, I'm coming back, not because I need them to love me, but because I deserve to be seen, exactly as I am." 2 weeks after filing, I received a letter from the court announcing the date of the initial hearing, a preliminary session to review evidence and determine the validity of the documents. It was scheduled for Wednesday, 9 a.m., at the Suffolk County Courthouse. I didn't feel afraid. The emotion was strange, not quite calm, but no longer panic like before. I spent the days leading up to it tidying my life, cleaning the apartment, placing Grandma's photo frame back on my desk, trimming a few wilted stems from the glass vase by the windowsill. These small acts helped me catch my breath again. I also returned to what once grounded me, reopening the interior design sketchbook I had abandoned a month ago, looking at photos of every room I had renovated in the old house. I remembered how I once poured all my passion into bringing life and warmth into each space, even when no one acknowledged it. But now it was different. I was learning to acknowledge myself. The night before court, I received a message from Harper, the first since the wedding. Just one line. "Are you sure you want to take this that far?" I didn't reply. I deleted the message and set my phone face down on the table. They still didn't understand. This wasn't about anger or jealousy. This was about dignity, about value, about truth. The next morning, I woke at 5:30, made a cup of peppermint tea, and put on a white blouse and a long ash-gray coat. Sophie picked me up at 7:15, just as promised. She dressed simply but neat, and didn't say much, only gently held my hand as we sat in the car, waiting at a red light on Huntington Avenue. "You don't have to prove anything to them anymore," she said, "but if you stand up today, then everyone who's ever felt invisible will know. They're not alone." I turned to her, said nothing, just squeezed her hand a little tighter. The Suffolk County Courthouse wasn't as grand as I imagined, just a 3-story red brick building with faded silver letters above the entrance. "Justice begins with truth." As I stepped inside, I saw my father standing next to Harper in the waiting area. He glanced at me but didn't nod. Harper stared straight ahead, phone in hand, face unreadable. Laura arrived a few minutes later. She handed me a final copy of the file and gently said, "We're ready." I took a deep breath. Everything around me seemed to slow. The sound of heels clicking, pens clicking, wind brushing past the window, all of it faded, leaving only the quiet thump of my heartbeat in my chest. But it wasn't the thump of fear. It was a firm, steady beat, like the first footsteps of someone emerging from the shadow that's followed them their whole life. We moved into the courtroom, a chamber paneled in dark oak, white ceiling lights casting down on long wooden tables and rows of cold seats. Everyone had their place. Laura sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, across from my father and Harper, who sat neatly dressed behind 2 young attorneys. The judge, a woman in her 60s, silver hair pulled back, eyes sharp and unwavering, read out the case title, Clara Emerson versus James Emerson and Harper Emerson for fraudulent transfer and breach of notarized will. The gavel fell. It began. Laura was the first to speak. She opened with a slow but steady voice, laying out the family relationship, the assets left by Beatrice Emerson, and the evidence showing Clara as the legal heir in the original will. She presented to the court the notarized will with the original signature, the audio recording between James and Harper, and financial records showing the $1.3 million transferred to Harper without consent from the rightful heir. The defendants not only violated the will, Laura said, but deliberately concealed and used the inheritance for personal gain, despite the lawful heir being alive and maintaining the estate left by the deceased. My father was called first. He stepped to the stand, adjusting his collar. The defense attorneys questioned him first, and he emphasized that everything was done out of love for the children. When it was Laura's turn, she asked directly, "Do you acknowledge that the original will clearly named Clara Emerson as the sole heir?" My father hesitated, then said, "I remember my mother mentioning Clara, but she was sick at the time, and we were only trying to do what was best for everyone." "So, do you believe forging a signature is ever justified under any circumstance?" I didn't think of it that way." I looked at him, and in his voice, I heard no remorse, only evasion. Harper was called next. She walked to the stand with a calm expression, but her hands clenched the hem of her dress. "Did you know the assets you received came from an unlawfully altered will?" "I only followed my parents' decisions. I didn't request anything directly." Laura nodded, then played a clip from the recording. "Dad, if I can launch my own brand, you and Mom won't have to worry about retirement. But Clara, I don't think she can really help." Harper closed her eyes, said nothing. The courtroom fell silent. The defense attorneys requested to stop the recording, but the judge raised her hand, signaling to let it play. At the final line, my father's voice, quietly laughing, "Let Clara think she's the chosen one. We'll sort it out later." The air seemed to tighten. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. "That's enough. The next session will be the formal trial for asset ownership." The hearing ended after nearly 2 hours. I stood and walked into the hallway. No one looked at me. My father walked straight ahead. Harper hurried behind him. But I no longer needed their gaze. At the courthouse steps, the wind blew strong. My hair swept across my forehead. Laura placed her hand on my shoulder. "You did very well? And this is only the beginning." I nodded. Ahead was a long, legal battle. But inside, one truth had settled. This time, I was not the one being judged. I was the one reclaiming the light. In the days after the hearing, I returned to daily life, but everything around me seemed to have shifted. Relatives no longer messaged. Those who once invited me to weddings, birthdays, Christmas dinners. Now, all silent. I heard that in the family group chat, my mother had removed my name from the list. Harper still didn't reach out. My father never called. Instead, I started receiving emails from people I never expected. A high school friend wrote, "You did the right thing." A woman in the design community thanked me for standing up to reclaim lost value. Even an anonymous person wrote just one line, "I was pushed out of my grandmother's estate too." I read each message in silence, saving them in a folder on my computer called "Not Alone Anymore." But at night, when the city was asleep, I still sometimes woke from dreams, standing in the old house, in an empty room, watching all the familiar faces walk away without looking back. Some nights I dreamed of Grandma. She sat on the bench on the porch, back to me, holding a cup of tea like always. I called out, "Grandma," but she didn't turn. I touched her shoulder, and she vanished, leaving only the cooling cup of tea. I woke with stinging eyes, wondering, am I going too far? But then morning came, and I saw the will, the photo of Grandma on the wall, her arms wrapped around me as a child, her kind eyes whispering, "No, Clara, you're not lost, you're finding yourself." Sophie still came over every weekend. She brought food, helped me water the plants, and never asked too much. "You don't need to be right in their eyes," she said. "You just need to be right with yourself." One afternoon, I visited Grandpa Austin. He sat on the porch reading the newspaper, old glasses in hand. When I arrived, he folded the paper and said, "Your father still doesn't see his fault, but that's no longer your responsibility. Everyone makes choices, and you chose not to be silent anymore." I sat beside him, quiet for a long while. He asked softly, "Are you scared?" I nodded. "Yes, but for the first time in my life, that fear doesn't make me back down." He smiled, poured more tea, and we sat there until the sun dipped behind the late summer maples. Inside me, the fire was no longer rage. It was steady, of resolve, of clarity, of renewal. I knew the official trial was near. But I wasn't going in to reclaim family ties. I was going in to reclaim a voice once stolen. Through truth, through justice, and in my own name. The official trial was set for a Tuesday morning in early October, cold enough that I wore a light coat. I arrived early, stood before the Suffolk County Courthouse for a long moment, looking up at the faded silver words. Justice begins with truth. Today, those words were no longer a slogan. They were an anchor. Laura joined me, case folder in hand. "Everything is ready," she said. The defendants didn't provide any new evidence to counter the recording or the original will, but they'll try to appeal to emotion, that families should settle things privately. I nodded. I was ready for that. Inside the courtroom, the air was no longer tense like before, but carried the cold solemnity of law. When the judge entered, everyone stood. She glanced across both sides, then began the proceedings. Laura spoke first, presenting the original will, the notary's verification, proof that Clara had solely covered the home's upkeep for the past 5 years. Then, she played the full recording, with my father's and Harper's voices, undeniable. The defense didn't offer much argument. Their lawyer only claimed that asset redistribution was an internal family decision based on practical needs. But the judge interrupted, stating clearly, "A will is a legal document, not emotional. If there's forgery involved, that's a serious violation." Then she turned to me. "Ms. Clara Emerson, do you have anything to say?" I stood. My voice wasn't loud, but each word felt drawn from years of silence. "I'm not here demanding affection or apology. I'm here to affirm that being considered not valuable enough does not justify being erased from a legal inheritance. I don't want to take anything from Harper. I just want to keep what my grandmother left me. Not because I'm perfect, but because I didn't abandon her home when everyone else did." The judge paused for a moment, then nodded slightly. "The court confirms the legal inheritance belongs to Clara Emerson, according to the original notarized will, with no signs of coercion. All property and investment rights are awarded to the plaintiff. Funds previously transferred unlawfully must be returned or converted into financial obligations to be negotiated in a civil agreement." The gavel struck, soft but final. I closed my eyes for a second, not to celebrate, but to breathe. Sophie squeezed my hand. Laura smiled, her first smile since I'd met her. My father didn't look at me. Harper stood frozen, hand gripping her purse, as if the world had collapsed beneath her own heels. But I didn't look at them for long. I turned away, walked out of the courtroom, where the autumn sunlight stretched across the old stone steps. Outside, Boston hummed as always. But inside me, something had settled. I no longer needed to prove anything, because justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand firm. I returned to my grandmother's house on an early winter afternoon. The wind rustled through the backyard, where the yellow chrysanthemums had nearly all fallen, leaving only slender dry branches leaning toward the cold sun. The house was silent, but no longer the kind of lonely silence it once held. It was the quiet of a place waiting to be revived. I turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open with its familiar sound, and the scent of old wood and dried lavender lingered in the air, like a breath of memory. I didn't go straight into the living room. I stood at the threshold for a long while, taking in every detail. The armchair where Grandma used to sit, the fireplace I had painted with my own hands, the family photo frame still tilted on the wall, untouched since she passed. I took off my coat, rolled up my sleeves, and started cleaning, not because it was dirty, but because I needed to reconnect with every corner of the space with my own hands. I wiped down the frame, straightened the leaning bookshelf, and placed a small vase of dried lavender on the kitchen table. Nothing elaborate, just a few stems I'd picked from the backyard. That first night, I slept in Grandma's old room. The round wooden bed by the window, where she used to read fairy tales to me as a child. The pillows smelled like sunlight, the sheets soft and cold. I didn't dream. The next morning, I woke as the light slipped through the curtain, made a cup of peppermint tea, and stepped onto the porch. The maple branches in the distance had shed nearly all their leaves, their bare arms reaching skyward. I followed the flight path of birds, my heart strangely light. No mother calling from the kitchen, no congratulations from my father, no sister coming to apologize. But I didn't need them. I still had myself, and after everything, that was enough. In my coat pocket, I still kept the will, worn, creased at the corners, but every line of ink still clear. I no longer saw it as a trophy. I saw it as a message from the woman who always believed that I could preserve something greater than material things: dignity. When I placed that paper into the small wooden drawer in her room, I realized I no longer felt anger, only a peace like late afternoon light, not dazzling, but gentle and true. I began renovating the house during the second week after moving back. No rush, no detailed plans like previous projects, just small steps, as if I were having a conversation with each brick, each crack, each peeling patch of paint. I kept most of the original architecture, the vaulted wooden ceilings, the stained glass window frames, even the worn-out stair rail, but I replaced the curtains with ones brighter, airier. I repainted the living room walls a warm cream, added a few abstract paintings I'd done during those isolated years. The dining room became an open space, where sunlight could stream in during the morning and warm yellow lamps could soften solitary dinners. I didn't replace everything. I blended. Between old and new. Between memory and choice. Grandma's room, now a reading nook, kept her old armchair, only reupholstered in coarse gray linen. On the small table, I placed her teacup and the book she'd left unfinished, still marked on page 147 with a dry leaf. In my workspace, I moved the desk closer to the window, where the light hit the wood squarely. My new laptop, a few interior sketches I was designing for small community spaces, cafes, libraries, reading corners for young women, were laid out in order, not for contracts, but because, for the first time in years, I wanted to build something that didn't need praise, only honesty. One weekend afternoon, Grandpa Austin came by. He stepped slowly onto the porch with his cane, eyes sweeping the scene as if greeting an old friend reborn. "This house," he said, then fell silent. We drank tea in the garden, where I was replanting a row of chrysanthemums, the exact kind Grandma used to love. "You've done something few in this family had the courage to do," he said finally. "Not to win back an estate, but to stand up when no one stood with you." I didn't respond. I just looked at him, then at the house. The place that once made me feel like I didn't belong, now slowly becoming a real home. Not one that needs a welcome sign, not one that needs applause, just a space to live the way I choose. And this house, once a wound, was becoming a place of healing. I found Grandma's letter on a light rainy afternoon while tidying an old drawer in the upstairs bedroom. Among notebooks, old receipts, and an unfinished embroidery piece, there was a small ivory envelope, sealed shut, with familiar slanted handwriting. "For Clara, when you're ready." My heart tightened for a brief beat. I sat at the edge of the bed, took a deep breath, and opened the envelope. The scent of aged paper, faint and soft, like the old wardrobe she used to keep. The letter was written in purple ink, the same kind she'd always used since I was little. She wrote, "Dearest Clara, if you are reading this, you've likely walked a difficult path. I can't stop others from treating you unfairly, nor stay forever to protect you. But I believe you'll know when it's time to stand up, and I believe you won't let loss make your heart shut down." I paused, eyes stinging. Rain tapped gently at the window like whispers. You have a special gift. You know how to turn small things into living spaces. And space, when created with love, can heal even the deepest wounds. I hope you won't just rebuild this house, but open it to those who need a place to begin again. I folded the letter, placed it in a small glass frame, and hung it on the wall beside my desk. That evening, I sat alone in the dining room, soft yellow lights on, the window cracked open so the scent of damp earth could drift in. I took out my notebook and wrote for the first time in a long while. Idea: a shared space for young women stepping out of toxic families. A place to rest, learn basic design, and begin building a home of their own. I didn't know where to begin, or who would come, but I knew I was ready. Grandma had taught me there are two ways to survive pain: build walls or build doors. And I, after everything, had chosen to open a door. 1 year after the trial, I held my first exhibit in the very house my grandmother left behind, now a home, a studio, and a place to begin again. I called the event "The Rooms We Open." Not a commercial showcase, but a small gathering where friends, design colleagues, friendly neighbors, and young women I'd met at community events could come, sit, see one another, and feel a house not made to close off, but to invite. I hung my interior sketches along the hallway. Not elaborate designs, but small spaces, reading corners, attic bedrooms, sunlit kitchens. Each drawing carried a handwritten note underneath. Healing spaces don't have to be big, only true. I set a tea table out on the porch where Grandpa Austin sat among a circle of young people, telling old stories, teacup in hand like always. Sophie helped with the pastries, the flowers, and guided guests through each room. A short-haired girl, around 24, wearing an oversized shirt and a canvas backpack, stood quietly for a long time in the reading room, where the old armchair still sat, and Grandma's letter hung framed on the wall. She turned to me and said softly, "I grew up in a home where no one listened. But today, I feel like I just stepped into a place that hears me." I smiled, just a little. In my heart, I whispered, "Grandma, do you see? Your house has become a place where people can touch their own existence." That night, after most guests had left, I stood alone on the porch, a cup of peppermint tea in hand, looking out at the backyard. The new chrysanthemums bloomed gold under the garden lights, herbs I'd planted lined the edge. The breeze carried scents of soil, wood, and faintly, an old trace of lavender. I didn't know if it was imagination or if Grandma was still here, in every corner, every coat of paint, every decision I once doubted. But I knew one thing for certain: I no longer sought validation from those who couldn't give it. I found it in the act of standing up, rebuilding, and opening myself. And this house, once born of a wound, had become an invitation to new beginnings. My story may have started with a stolen will, a house nearly forgotten. But what I reclaimed was not just property. It was my voice. And if you've listened this far, maybe somewhere in you has also felt forgotten. In a family, a relationship, or a room where no one listened. I want you to know, you are not alone. And you don't need someone's permission to speak. If my story touched you, or reminded you of someone who deserves to be seen, acknowledged, and to begin again, please like, share this video, and subscribe. Not to spread pain, but to spread hope. We can't change the past, but we can choose to build doors instead of walls. And sometimes, a door opened is the very place someone finally believes they are worthy.